Do you think you know Steve Harrington just because of his perfect hair and easy smile? Well, you are mistaken. Behind the high school heartthrob, there is a boy who grew up feeling abandonment, fear of loneliness, and the need to be loved at any cost. And the craziest thing is that these pains, which seemed like weaknesses, are exactly what turned him into one of the most human and empathetic characters in Stranger Things. But how does someone so carefree at the beginning of the series become so protective, so brave, and so emotionally complex? The answer will surprise you, and it might even make you rethink how you deal with your own traumas and relationships. If you are a fan of cinema psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any video. But first, comment below which character you want me to analyze here on the channel. Now let us go to the video. Steve Harrington is the kind of guy who, if you studied in an American school, there was definitely a version of him there. Handsome, popular, impeccable hair, the classic 1980s heartthrob who seemed to have life figured out. But unlike the stereotype, Steve is one of those rare exceptions where the character who begins as a cliché ends up becoming the emotional heart of the story. And that is exactly what makes his journey so interesting. He is the living example that growing up is a process and not an event. At the beginning, Steve is the boy who lives in the shadow of his own appearance. Everything about him seems to revolve around image, the hair, the reputation, the relationship with Nancy, the parties. But as the real world and the supernatural world starts knocking on his door, the perfect facade begins to crack. And that is when we discover who he really is. Because when the glamour falls, what remains is the human being, and the human being is much more complex than the high school king he appeared to be. The most curious thing is that Steve was never the obvious protagonist. He started as an arrogant supporting character, the kind you expected to hate until the last episode. But little by little, the script shifts. He becomes someone who cares, protects, and sacrifices himself, the kind of person who ironically has no superpowers but becomes a hero anyway. It is almost poetic to see the popular guy become the group's official babysitter. And between us, what a delightful plot twist, right? And maybe that is what connects so many people to him, the fact that Steve represents that moment when we realize that being cool means nothing if there is no depth. He learns this in the most painful way possible, losing people, status, and certainties. It is the kind of growth that does not happen overnight, but that leaves beautiful scars, the kind that tell a story of overcoming, of someone who got a lot wrong before getting things right. Behind the charming smile, there is a boy trying to prove something he himself does not even know. He wants to be accepted, but he also wants to be truly seen, not just admired. And this is a very common struggle, right? How many times do we wear a mask just to keep up appearances? Steve is the mirror of that. He is the guy who deep down just wanted to hear "you are good enough" from someone, maybe from his parents, maybe from himself. And speaking of parents, it is impossible to ignore the emptiness he carries from that relationship. The emotional absence, the silent abandonment. It is as if he learned to be the popular guy to fill the silence at home. A boy who grew up surrounded by people but always felt alone, and that loneliness disguised as self-confidence slowly reveals itself, especially when the world around him begins to fall apart. But that is when the real Steve begins to emerge. When he realizes that the image he created no longer protects him, he needs to find something more solid to hold on to, and he finds that in genuine connections in the unlikely friendships with Dustin, Robin, and the group. It is as if the high school king lost the throne but gained a purpose. Maturity arrives when he understands that caring is the new cool. And you know what is most interesting? Steve does not change because someone forces him. He changes because the world forces him, and he chooses to react with empathy and not cynicism. He chooses to be different, and that choice is what makes him so human. Because deep down, we have all been a Steve at some point in our lives, trying to look strong while inside, we just wanted to find our place. But what happens when this boy, who tries so hard to take care of others, begins to realize that no one ever took care of him? Steve is the kind of person who smiles easily but carries an emptiness inside that he himself cannot fully understand. The kind of guy who jokes to hide the pain, and let us be honest, we all know people like that. He tries to fill the internal silence with external noise, parties, friends, relationships, even the chaos of monsters from the upside down, because sometimes it is easier to fight bizarre creatures than to face your own feelings. One of his biggest wounds is the lack of belonging. Despite being popular, Steve never really seems part of anything. He is everywhere but never feels at home. It is the paradox of the guy loved by everyone but known by no one, and that weighs heavily. When the whole world applauds you but no one truly sees you, it is like screaming in a packed stadium and realizing your voice gets lost in the echo. Another point is the fear of abandonment. Steve has a kind of emotional radar that makes him avoid deep connections because subconsciously he believes he will be left behind again. That is why he hesitates to show vulnerability. He learned too early that being vulnerable is giving ammunition to be hurt, so he builds a shield made of charm and sarcasm. It works for a while until the shield starts to crack. And there is also the identity crisis. Steve does not really know who he is when the role of high school heartthrob no longer makes sense. It is that post-adolescence moment many people go through, when what defined you stops existing, and you need to discover who you are without the label. He goes from popular boyfriend to babysitter of teenage monster hunters. It sounds funny, but it is symbolic. He trades status for purpose even if he does not yet realize it consciously. Deep down, Steve is afraid of being ordinary. This is a curious trauma. The trauma of someone who was taught to believe that value lies in performance, and when the shine fades, the fear of not being enough appears. This is very common in people who grew up admired but not loved. They confuse attention with affection and compliments with connection, and when the audience leaves, the silence hurts more than any criticism. An interesting detail is how he deals with rejection. Steve does not explode, he shrinks. Instead of facing the emptiness, he tries to adapt to be what the other person wants him to be. This shows a pattern of emotional codependence. He wants to be useful, indispensable, loved, and in the process he loses himself a little. How many times do we do the same thing? We take care of others so much that we forget to take care of ourselves. This internal conflict places him in a dilemma. He wants to connect but fears showing himself. He wants to be seen but hides what he feels. And this impasse leaves him stuck in a cycle of emotional self-sabotage. It is that eternal fight between I want to be myself and I want to be accepted. And honestly, who has never felt that? The problem is that Steve tries to solve everything alone, which leaves him exhausted and more needy than he would like to admit. And this is when we start to understand where his fear of abandonment comes from. Because behind the smile and the humor, there is a boy who grew up hearing doors closing instead of loving words. A boy who learned to protect himself by being too nice, but like every armor, this one also gets heavy. And this is where we enter Steve Harrington's first big trauma. The emptiness left by his parents' emotional absence, the emotional absence of the parents. Steve grew up surrounded by luxury, but emotionally it was like living in a huge house with an echo. You know, the kind of home where silence says more than any conversation. That is it. His parents were always financially present, but emotionally absent. And the curious part is that when presence becomes absence, a child learns to fend for themselves, but also learns to hide what they feel. Steve became an expert at that. The master of the calm facade. He had no model of true care. No one taught him how to deal with frustration, fear, or rejection. So he did what any smart and insecure young person would do. He created a character, the popular Steve, confident, surrounded by friends. But what he really wanted was a real hug, and I am proud of you coming from someone who mattered. When affection does not come from home, we start looking for it everywhere else, and sometimes in the wrong places. This absence from his parents did not only generate loneliness, it generated a kind of learned self-abandonment. Steve grew up believing his feelings were secondary, that the important thing was keeping up appearances. So he gets used to swallowing what he feels, smiling when he is sad, giving of himself to be accepted. It is the classic "I am fine" said by someone who clearly is not. And this, deep down, is a desperate attempt to prove he can be enough without needing anyone. The most interesting part is that Steve does not rebel against his parents. He rationalizes. He creates excuses for their absence, trying to fill the gaps with humor and distractions. This is a common defense. The mind tries to protect the heart, masking pain with logic. They work a lot. That is why they are not around. He must have thought 1,000 times, but his inner child knows love that needs to be justified is love that is not being felt. And this kind of wound deeply shapes how he relates to others. He tries to be what he never had, the caregiver. And that is where babysitter Steve is born, the guy who protects the kids of Hawkins, as if he were trying to save his own younger version. It is beautiful, right? But also painful, because every time he takes care of someone, deep down, he is saying, I hope no one feels the emptiness I felt. Another reflection of this absence is the fear of creating roots. Steve wants to connect, but something inside him says that bonds mean pain. So he keeps himself kind of floating in relationships, always close enough to care, but far enough not to be hurt. And that explains why so many of his moments seem to mix sweetness and distance. He wants to be close, but the trauma teaches, be careful, love goes away. This lack of emotional support also made him someone who constantly searches for validation. He wants to be the good friend, the ideal boyfriend, the hero of the group, any role that gives him a sense of worth. But this creates an invisible prison. He lives for the gaze of others, not his own. It is as if he were saying, if no one noticed me when I was a child, now I will do anything so they see me. And this anything sometimes includes losing himself. And it is exactly at this point that Steve's emotional journey begins to change. Because there comes a moment when caring too much starts to hurt. And when the caretaker gets tired, it is a sign that the forgotten boy inside wants to be seen. He no longer wants to only give love, he wants to receive it too. And it is from this need that the next chapter of his story is born, the search for validation and love through relationships. The search for validation and love through relationships. When someone grows up without enough love, it is natural to try to compensate for that somehow. And Steve does exactly this. He turns romance into a kind of mirror. He wants to see himself reflected in the eyes of someone who chooses him, who validates him. In the beginning, he thinks love is a stage, that acting the right way is enough to be loved. But real love is not performance, it is vulnerability. And Steve takes a long time to understand that. His relationship with Nancy is the perfect portrait of this confused search. He wants to be the ideal boyfriend, the reliable guy, the protector. But behind this attempt, there is a fear of not being enough. He does not only want Nancy's love, he wants her to be living proof that he is worthy of being loved. It is beautiful and tragic at the same time, because when love becomes a measure of worth, it stops being light and becomes heavy. And when that love ends, Steve breaks a little on the inside. He tries to move on, but carries that kind of pain that is not only about losing the person, it is about losing the identity he created with her. It is as if, by losing Nancy, he also lost the version of himself he believed would finally be accepted. Who has not gone through this? That emptiness that makes you think if not even giving your best was enough, then what is missing in you? The truth is that Steve confuses being needed with being loved. He wants to care, protect, fix things as if love required usefulness. But love does not ask you to prove anything. It asks you to be present. And that is why, even after trying again and again, Steve finds himself repeating the same cycle. It is the typical case of someone who loves by trying to fix the other, when what he really needed was to heal himself. The most beautiful part is that he does not become cynical over time. On the contrary, he keeps believing in love. Except little by little, he starts to understand that true affection is not about being chosen, but about choosing himself. It is emotional maturity disguised as loneliness. He allows himself to be alone, and in that solitude discovers something powerful. The love he always searched for on the outside needed to start on the inside. And that is where Robin comes in. Their friendship is almost therapeutic. With her, Steve learns to love without needing to be loved back in a romantic way. He discovers the value of presence, of honest connection, of being there because he wants to, not because he needs to prove something. This relationship teaches him that vulnerability is not weakness, it is courage, and that lesson completely changes how he sees himself. The curious thing is that even with his heart patched up, Steve never loses his humor. He jokes about his own frustrations, laughs at the chaos, but behind that lightness there is a silent wisdom. He understands that love does not need to be a prize. It can be an experience. And when he accepts that, he stops searching for validation and starts searching for reciprocity. And that is when the king of the school finally steps down from the throne and becomes truly human. But what really solidifies this turning point is empathy. Steve stops being the guy who wants to be loved and becomes the guy who loves, not out of neediness, but out of choice. He learns to be present without needing applause. And it is exactly at this point that the new Steve is born, the guy who discovers, in the middle of chaos, the power of caring genuinely. The transformation of Steve and the birth of his real empathy. There comes a point when life hits you so hard that the ego wakes up. And with Steve, it was more or less like that. He was forced to look inward and realize that to be truly loved, he needed to love himself first. And this turning point does not happen with beautiful speeches, but with small gestures. The guy who once sought approval starts to find meaning in simply being there, caring, listening, being someone reliable. It is the kind of change that has no epic soundtrack, but transforms everything. What is most impressive is how this transformation comes from simple experiences. Steve does not change because of a great romance or a heroic event. He changes because he lives moments of true connection. Sincere conversations with Robin, his friendship with Dustin, the feeling of belonging and the chaos of Hawkins. It is in the margins of life that he finds what he always looked for, a place where he can be who he is without needing to perform anything. It is curious how suffering can shape empathy. Steve, who once reacted superficially, begins to notice the pain of others. He understands that everyone has their monsters, some literal, others internal. And suddenly, he becomes the kind of friend everyone would like to have, someone who does not try to fix you. He just makes you feel less alone. That is pure emotional maturity. And the most beautiful part is that he does this without even noticing. This change does not make him perfect, of course. He continues to make mistakes, to get confused, to be somewhat clumsy with emotions. But now there is something new in him, awareness. He understands when he is running away, when he is trying too hard to fit in, when fear speaks louder. And this self-awareness, even if unconscious, brings him closer to people in a real way. He no longer needs to be the popular one, now he is the present one. There is something very human about this turning point. It is the moment when Steve realizes that empathy is not only feeling what the other person feels, it is respecting their time and pain. It is creating space without judgment. It is a lesson most people take years to learn, and he gets there stumbling like any of us. And maybe it is exactly this imperfection that makes him such a captivating character. He makes mistakes beautifully, and we cannot ignore how his humor changes to before. Steve used laughter to mask the pain. Now he uses it to comfort, to disarm, to create connection. He is the kind of person who makes jokes not to escape, but to get closer. And this shows how much he has evolved emotionally, because humor, when born from empathy, becomes a tool for healing rather than escape. This new version of Steve also begins to see the value in non-romantic relationships. He finds in his friends a new form of love, one that does not charge, does not demand, it simply exists. And this is powerful. It is the kind of affection that sustains, that grounds you. Being with the group makes him understand that caring for others can be more meaningful than being the protagonist of his own story. And it is exactly this turning point that places him in another role within the narrative, the role of protector. The guy who once needed to be cared for is now the one who cares, and not out of neediness, but out of conscious choice. And it is here that one of the most emotional chapters of Steve Harrington's journey begins. The awakening of his instinct to care and the construction of his role as a protective figure. The transformation of Steve and the birth of his real empathy. There comes a point when life hits you so hard that the ego wakes up, and with Steve it was more or less like that. He was forced to look inward and realize that to be truly loved, he needed to love himself first. And this turning point does not happen with beautiful speeches, but with small gestures. The guy who once sought approval starts to find meaning in simply being there, caring, listening, being someone reliable. It is the kind of change that has no epic soundtrack, but transforms everything. What is most impressive is how this transformation comes from simple experiences. Steve does not change because of a great romance or a heroic event. He changes because he lives moments of true connection. Sincere conversations with Robin, his friendship with Dustin, the feeling of belonging in the chaos of Hawkins. It is in the margins of life that he finds what he always looked for, a place where he can be who he is without needing to perform anything. It is curious how suffering can shape empathy. Steve, who once reacted superficially, begins to notice the pain of others. He understands that everyone has their monsters, some literal, others internal. And suddenly, he becomes the kind of friend everyone would like to have, someone who does not try to fix you, he just makes you feel less alone. That is pure emotional maturity. And the most beautiful part is that he does this without even noticing. This change does not make him perfect, of course. He continues to make mistakes, to get confused, to be somewhat clumsy with emotions, but now there is something new in him: awareness. He understands when he is running away, when he is trying too hard to fit in, when fear speaks louder. And this self-awareness, even if unconscious, brings him closer to people in a real way. He no longer needs to be the popular one. Now he is the present one. There is something very human about this turning point. It is the moment when Steve realizes that empathy is not only feeling what the other person feels, it is respecting their time and pain. It is creating space without judgment. It is a lesson most people take years to learn, and he gets there stumbling like any of us. And maybe it is exactly this imperfection that makes him such a captivating character. He makes mistakes beautifully, and we cannot ignore how his humor changes to before. Steve used laughter to mask the pain. Now he uses it to comfort, to disarm, to create connection. He is the kind of person who makes jokes not to escape, but to get closer. And this shows how much he has evolved emotionally. Because humor, when born from empathy, becomes a tool for healing rather than escape. This new version of Steve also begins to see the value in non-romantic relationships. He finds in his friends a new form of love, one that does not charge, does not demand, it simply exists. And this is powerful. It is the kind of affection that sustains, that grounds you. Being with the group makes him understand that caring for others can be more meaningful than being the protagonist of his own story. And it is exactly this turning point that places him in another role within the narrative, the role of protector. The guy who once needed to be cared for is now the one who cares, and not out of neediness, but out of conscious choice. And it is here that one of the most emotional chapters of Steve Harrington's journey begins: the awakening of his instinct to care and the construction of his role as a protective figure. The role of Steve as a protective figure and his caring instinct. There are people who turn pain into walls. Steve turned it into a bridge. The guy who grew up without receiving care learned to offer what he never had. And isn't it beautiful when life makes these ironies? He could have become cold, closed off, indifferent. But no, he chose to care. And this protective instinct that grows in him is, at the same time, his strength and his fragility. The way he relates to Dustin is the biggest symbol of this shift. The friendship between them is almost paternal. Steve goes from king of the school to official babysitter of teenagers, and the most curious thing is that he embraces this role without complaining. Because deep down, caring for others gives meaning to his life. It is as if with every protective gesture, he healed a small piece of the boy who was forgotten back then. This caring instinct is not heroism, it is empathy in its purest form. Steve does not act for glory. He does not want applause. He does it because he feels it. He puts himself at risk, faces danger, but what drives all of this is the fear of losing the people he loves. It is a deeply human emotional response. Those who have lost too many presences in life do everything they can to avoid losing anyone else. It is love disguised as bravery. The most interesting thing is that even without realizing it, Steve redefines the concept of masculinity within the series. He shows that being a man is not being cold, distant, invincible. It is being sensitive, protective, vulnerable, and still strong. He breaks the stereotype of the popular boy and becomes the example of emotional maturity that many people dream of reaching. He shows that empathy is not weakness, it is power. But the role of caregiver has its price. When you get used to taking care of everyone, sometimes you forget that you also need to be cared for. And Steve lives this dilemma all the time. He is always there for everyone, but who is there for him? He is the typical big heart that, from giving too much, ends up emptying itself. It is beautiful, but dangerous because the protector also gets tired, even if he never admits it. And this silent exhaustion is noticeable between the lines. You see it in his eyes, in the pauses, in the moments when he tries to smile, but his eyes show tiredness. He learned to be the pillar, but he forgot that even pillars crack. And this creates a very real emotional layer. The conflict between the desire to care and the need to be seen. He is the savior who also needs rescue. Even so, Steve does not give up. He is that friend who goes first, who holds the flashlight in the dark, who says everything will be fine even while trembling inside. And maybe that is why the audience becomes so attached to him, because all of us have been a little like Steve at some point in life. We have all tried to protect someone while barely knowing how to protect ourselves. But behind this everyday hero, there is a fear he cannot push away, the fear of loneliness. Because deep down, no matter how many people surround him, there is a part of him that fears being left behind, forgotten, again. And it is precisely this fear, silent but constant, that reveals the next big trauma of Steve Harrington: loneliness and the fear of being left behind. Loneliness and the fear of being left behind. Steve, despite all his humor and charm, carries a silent loneliness that few notice. He is surrounded by people but feels that no one truly sees who he is. It is that cruel paradox, being together and feeling alone. Who has never felt that, right? His heart learned to protect itself by hiding the emptiness, but the inner child still cries out for attention and connection. This fear of being left behind does not come from nowhere. It comes from past experiences, from the absence of affectionate figures who should have offered security. Steve learned that to be noticed, he needed to shine, to stand out. But shining too much is exhausting, and the shine alone does not fill the emptiness. And so the silent fear is born that, no matter how much he tries, there will always be someone who moves on without him, and this affects how he relates to others. Steve avoids exposing what he feels because vulnerability means the risk of rejection. He prefers to maintain the facade of everything is fine and give himself to others, even when internally he is needing support. It is the kind of behavior many of us repeat, caring for others to feel valuable, even when we need care ourselves. His loneliness also creates moments of internal doubt. Every decision, every gesture carries the weight of the fear of being left behind. He thinks twice before trusting, before opening up, before depending on someone. And this constant caution is exhausting because loving and caring without allowing yourself to be loved requires energy that is not always sustainable. However, it is precisely in this fear that Steve finds strength. The need not to lose himself in loneliness drives him to create genuine bonds, to value true friendships, and to be present when others need him most. He transforms fear into action, and this action shapes his protective identity. It is as if each small choice against loneliness were also a step toward emotional growth. And there is a sad charm in this loneliness. It makes him more human, closer to all of us. Steve reminds us that being afraid of being left behind is not weakness, it is humanity. It is the echo of those who have already felt invisible, of those who had to learn on their own that love and acceptance also need to be sought, not just received. Even with this fear, Steve shows resilience. He continues exposing himself, caring, taking risks, even knowing he might get hurt. It is this silent courage that sets him apart from many characters. He is not perfect, but he is real, and it is precisely the reality of his flaws and fears that connects us to him. And it is at this point that we can tie all the threads together, all the traumas, fears, and pains of Steve Harrington: the absence of his parents, the search for validation, the complex relationships, the newly discovered empathy, and the fear of loneliness come together to shape a unique personality. Steve is a living example of how traumas do not define us, but they shape us. Every absence, every fear, and every mistake contributed to building a resilient personality. He learned to use his pain as fuel to grow, transforming insecurity into empathy and vulnerability into strength. He is proof that the journey matters just as much as the final destination. The emotional absence of his parents taught him to care for others, to fill the gaps he himself felt in childhood. This protective instinct is not superficial. It became the foundation of the Steve we all know. Caring became purpose, and purpose brought meaning to his life. He no longer needs to prove anything, but he still chooses to give, and that makes him admirable and deeply human. His search for validation and love shaped the way he relates to others. He learned the hard way that value does not come from external recognition, but from the love we genuinely give and receive. This is reflected in conscious choices. He no longer seeks to be popular, he seeks to be present. And it is this presence that transforms how others perceive him and how he perceives himself. The fear of loneliness and of being left behind keeps him alert and empathetic. Steve developed a unique sensitivity to perceive when someone needs support, when a situation demands extra care. This sensitivity is born from his own pain, creating a virtuous cycle. Those who have suffered learn to prevent others from suffering the same way. It is empathy generated by personal experience. Even his flaws, insecurity, impulsiveness, the need to please contribute to his authenticity. Steve is not perfect, but he is real. He shows that personality is not the absence of mistakes, but the sum of choices, successes, and lessons. And this authenticity captivates because it reminds us of ourselves. We are all a mix of traumas, effort, and growth. Steve's sense of humor is also a mark, shaped by his experiences. He learned to use lightness as a bridge to connect with others, as a tool to soften conflicts and create bonds. This humor, born from pain, transformed into empathy, is the expression of emotional intelligence that few characters achieve. It is charm, but also wisdom, and that is why he becomes such a remarkable, protective figure. Steve does not act out of obligation or glory. He acts out of choice and awareness. Each caring gesture carries the story of someone who learned to survive emotionally, to grow through pain, and to transform suffering into genuine presence. He is a character who symbolizes what it truly means to mature. In the end, all of Steve Harrington's wounds come together to form someone complex, human, and inspiring. He teaches us that traumas do not have to be prisons, but can be guides. That pain can generate empathy, that loneliness can awaken courage, and that loving truly is a daily learning process. And that is how Steve Harrington becomes the character who, from cliché heartthrob to unlikely hero, conquers us in an unforgettable way. So tell me, what did you think of this analysis of Steve? Did any part of his story hit differently for you? Sometimes we see a character and, without realizing it, recognize a small part of ourselves in them, and that is exactly what makes these analyses so powerful. So tell me, which insight caught your attention the most today? And of course, which character do you want me to analyze in the next video? It can be someone from Stranger Things, from another series, movie, anime, whatever you want. This channel is a space for us to dive together, understand behaviors, traumas, choices, and on top of that, learn a bit more about ourselves along the way. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way you won't miss the next episodes and can continue this journey with me. Exploring the psychological side of the characters we love,